So our first speaker today in this afternoon session is Yuk Hui. Yuk Hui is a philosopher from Hong Kong. He obtained a PhD in Goldsmiths College in London, and his habilitation in philosophy from Leuphana University in Lüneburg. He teaches at the City University of Hong Kong, and his latest book is Art and Cosmotechnics, which came out in 2021. Yuk, I'm very happy to meet you, and please go ahead. Without any further ado, let me introduce him. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for the introduction, but also thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that you can hear me well. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to share my slides first. So, as we all know, that the theme of the conference is on quantum and on artificial imagination. So I accept the invitation to respond to the concept of artificial imagination. And actually, it is a conversation that I already started in 2018, 4 years ago, with the French artist Gregory Chatonsky. At the time, we had a conference at the Économat Supérieur in Paris back in early 2018. And this time, the subject come back again, and the organizers of this conference raised a very speculative question concerning artificial imagination, which they propose or frame as an imagination that is exclusively machinic and exclusively understood only by artificial intelligence. I would like to develop my reflection on this question of artificial imagination, and I would like to start by inquiring into the nature of imagination itself. So in order to approach two senses of artificial imagination, so I'll try to show two kind of meanings that I wanted to discuss with regarding to the concept of artificial imagination, because I find it particularly interesting that instead of intelligence, but imagination come to the front. Now, what is imagination is fundamental, because without an elaboration on this question, then we fail to understand what it really means by artificial imagination, and to see it merely as a production of images, as the word imagination or Einbildungskraft in German means the production of images. And it is true that machines today, especially with machine learning algorithms, are capable of producing images that surprise human beings. So for example, those images we can see here, that it's very difficult for the audience to distinguish which one is produced by machines and which one is produced by professional painters. So they are becoming more and more capable algorithms regarding their precision and sophistication, and consequently, they are thought to be able to replace artistic. There's a question there. It's normal that it's not in the presentation mode. Otherwise, I would not be able to see my slides. But I would like to show first that imagination is not only about the production of image. In the contrary, to think about imagination is necessary to go beyond images. So I wanted to also talk about the question, that would be my second point, talk about how to go beyond images. It's a fallacy to think of artificial imagination as equivalent to human imagination. And this constitutes a big problem today. That's to say, to juxtapose human imagination with artificial imagination, because it's not only unproductive, according to my point of view, but also prevents us from uncovering the problems that we may follow Immanuel Kant by calling it the conflict of faculties. So instead, I hope to show that it is necessary to think artificial imagination organologically. Let me show the word, organologically, in the sense that technology should be recognized as an organ instead of something detached from the human or the human world. And the failure to recognize this organological nature of imagination easily gives rise to an optimism as well as an pessimism of technological accelerations. Today, we all recognize that determination through calculation in larger scale has well arrived, as well as experienced that we all experienced during the pandemic. And I think Professor Kosas is going to talk about later about the lockdown in Shanghai. I'm very curious. The word imagination achieves its banality if it means simply a preemptive logic based on calculation. The question of artificial imagination should be situated, and I would like to propose, in a broader context in related to aesthetic education, artistic creation, as well as politics, in view of the role machines are playing in terms of decision-making and the shaping of our environment. So I think if we want to talk about artificial imagination, we should situate in a broader program, for example, aesthetic education, which I want to talk about. And when I say aesthetic education, I refer precisely to Schiller's aesthetic, the Ästhetische Erziehung, which doesn't really mean a formal education Ausbildung, but rather a cultivation of a sensibility towards aesthetic forms. Schiller was addressing a question analogical to our time, namely the confrontation between laws of nature, that is to say, the determinations of rationality of state and human freedom. So on the one hand, there is the rationality of the state, and on the other hand, there's the human freedom. Concerning the third antinomy that Immanuel Kant has famously laid down in the Critique of Pure Reason, namely the opposition between the mutual exclusion between laws of nature and freedom. So maybe you can see here, this is the famous third antinomy. The causality according to laws of nature is not the only causality from which the appearances of the world can thus one and all be derived. In order to explain these appearances, it is necessary to assume also a causality through freedom. So freedom is at bottom, is fundamental. The antithesis runs like, there is no freedom, but everything in the world occurs solely according to laws of nature. The famous antinomy concerning freedom and reason. But Schiller wanted to overcome and bridge this opposition in a different way, in the third way. And I also would like to remind that when Schiller was writing the aesthetic education, he was also referring to the failure of the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, there was an opposition between the governmentality of the state and the freedom of the individuals. And his solution, or what he proposed to overcome these oppositions, on the one hand, between rationality and feeling, state and individual freedom, is through what he called aesthetic education. And that means art. And in this construction, the aesthetic relation takes up an organological function, as I said earlier, organological function, meaning that it presents itself as a unifying force constituting a living form, a lebende Gestalt. When I say Schiller is raising a question analogous to ours, because this imposition of rationality in the name of calculation has also arrived at last, fully revealed in the transhumanist politics and the biopolitics of the COVID-19. Now, let me try to approach the precise meaning of artificial imagination, and then towards the end, I will come back to Sheila again. First of all, I would like to show that imagination is fundamentally artificial. That's to say, there is no imagination without artificiality. Now, we know, as I said before, that the word imagination already carries image in it, such as in German Einbildungskraft. Einbilden precisely means the force of producing images. The imagination is to make present something that is not yet present to me, precisely because imagination is an act of freedom, which starts with the given and arrive at a telos intrinsic to its own capacity. Imagination is ultimately a mysterious force. That was also why artists and poets were condemned by Plato in his dialogues. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant trying to explain what it means by artificial imagination, by imagination. Kant says imagination has to bring the manifold of intuitions into the form of an image. So basically, imagination is about production of an image. He considers the transcendental imagination as the ground from which sensibility and the understanding of receptivity and spontaneity grow. Heidegger describes in his comments on Kant transcendental imagination as the spontaneous receptivity or receptive spontaneity. Now, but the ground of imagination is unknown, where we don't know where exactly it is from. And the transcendental imagination is a strange force inside the transcendental apperception in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant says that synthesis in general is a simple effect of imagination. However, it is a blind, I quote here, blind but indispensable function of the soul. So imagination is fundamental, but we don't know where exactly it is from. As some of you may know, that in the edition B of the Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1786, that's to say 6 years after the publication of edition A, Kant has undermined the role of the transcendental imagination, and it is now understanding alone, well, in the hierarchy of the faculties, is the understanding alone that is responsible for the schematization of images. In his book, in his book, where here I refer to the book of Heidegger, in his book, we are trying to make the slides smaller, if I can. Right. Heidegger explored the significance of Kant's modification in his Kant and Problem of Metaphysics, and retrospectively, the book can be read as a critique of the neo-Kantians who want to lay down science, especially mathematical logic, as the ground of Kant's transcendental philosophy. Now, Heidegger instead mobilized these two different versions, the difference in the two versions of Critique of Pure Reason, in order to show that Kant, shrinking back, what he tried to undermine the role of the transcendental imagination in edition B, precisely exposes the foundation of metaphysics, because transcendental imagination is not a logical operation, and I emphasize not a logical operation, but rather a temporal operation which should be situated within the finitude of existence. In his book, Bernard Stiegler, that's the third volume of Techniques and Time, volume 3, attempts to show through his reading of Kant, but also his reading of Heidegger's commentary on Kant, three symphons, namely apprehension in the intuition, reproduction in the imagination, and recognition in the concept. Now, this is basically the three syntheses, fundamental syntheses in the cognitive capacity of the human mind. So, what Stigler claims is that they will not be able to complete their function without a fourth synthesis, which is artifact. Because recognition implies that something is kept in memory. So if we are able to recognize something, it's because we have already stored something in our memory. However, this memory will have to be supported by an external memory, external one. For example, symbols. The concept of the infinite, for example, is only graspable through the sign infinite here. So, for example, if we will not be able to, we don't understand the infinite by counting from 0 to infinite, but rather we recognize the concept of the infinite through the symbol of the infinite. So we may want to follow Stigler here by calling it the fourth, this external memory, the fourth synthesis. Now, the question of imagination will be complicated here because it will directly involve the fourth synthesis in its own operation. So that is why I claimed at the beginning that imagination is always artificial, in that sense that it demands an artificiality as the support of its own functioning. With the advancements of digital technology, the fourth synthesis constitutes a computational hermeneutics in which human and machines relation has to be conceived as a recursive coupling. Now, if we follow the above arguments that imagination is fundamentally artificial, then it is essential to inquire into the history of the artificiality from literary writing to analog writing and now digital forms in order to understand the question of imagination. The artificial imagination that we are invited to reflect on is no longer a passive medium of support, but also an active participation in the cognitive process. The question remains to be asked is, what is this new form of artificial imagination, let's say in the case of artificial intelligence, machine learning that we are talking about? And I would like to approach this question here from the perspective of the infinite, not only because I showed the symbol, but I think that because it has been argued that human imagination is infinite. Human can always make an infinite imagination, but machines' imagination is finite and limited. However, I try to argue that it is not it's no means a good demarcation to make the difference. And here comes to the second part, the infinite in the finite, mathematics and aesthetics. The first infinity, of course, is the bad infinity, as we know in the sense of Hegel, that it means a homogeneous increase without determination, without termination. For example, we add from 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 to infinite. This is bad infinite. It is a mere repetition without end, or with a more sophisticated example to find the largest prime number, which was a method that one used to hold a shared computer in the early times so that no one could use the computer. The second infinite is the mathematical infinity that is fundamental to calculation. So Leibniz is the thinker of the mathematical infinite. His metaphysics and calculus are based on the concept of the infinitesimal, which is the indivisible, but without minimum. We know that in Leibniz calculus, the curve is divided into infinitesimal parts, and the area under the curve is the sum of all the infinitesimal parts. Like the curve, the sound of the wave of the ocean consists of infinitesimal noises, which is called la petite perception, which though cannot be distinguished individually, but they exist on their own right. The infinitesimal, whereas as the infinite is possible, it's possible to be expressed by the finite number of signs, and this is a basic principle of Leibniz philosophy of substance. But I think I have to skip some because I don't have enough time on that. So I just want to give you a simple example here with, for example, when we deal with the question of pi in infinite number, but actually through an algorithm, we can actually contain the infinite within the finite. So Leibniz formula can be, of course, today translated into a recursive algorithm with into a very simple recursive algorithm. And here we find in algorithm a completeness that is analogical to the complete notion of an individual substance according to Leibniz. And with the concept of recursivity that recursively reproduces itself, such substantiality is measured by the minimum amount of code required to express such word or such result. And it is also the reason which the mathematicians Gregory Shatkin believe that the best of all possible world of Leibniz is one that uses the minimum code to produce the maximum variety of phenomenon. As it is said by Leibniz here, we quote, God has chosen the most perfect world, that is, the one which is at the same time the simplest in hypothesis and the richest in phenomena, as might be a line in geometry whose construction is easy and whose properties and effects are extremely remarkable and widespread. But I do not claim to explain in this way the great mystery upon which the entire universe depends. So an algorithm encloses a world like a monad reflects the world in its entirety, like the nomad's algorithm constructs the world according to simple axioms. But excuse me, can I ask how much time do I still have?
I think I have another. You can go ahead, yeah.
Excuse me?
Go ahead, yeah. Please continue.
May I ask how much time do I still have? Because I wouldn't want to overrun. And I still have some slides.
10 minutes, okay?
No, okay, no response. Okay, then I probably will. So please stop me if there's running out of time. So what I'm trying to show here, maybe I'm not going to read because there's running out of time. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that, firstly, in the algorithms, we can claim that in algorithms it is an attempt to contain the infinite in the finite, and this is what we find also in the machine imagination. But what I'm trying to say is that this is only a mathematical infinite. This is only as a mathematical infinite, and it has to be distinguished from the aesthetic infinite. The aesthetic infinite here I refer to the concept of the sublime that we can find, for example, in Immanuel Kant, when Kant was trying to describe the sublime. The mathematical sublime of Kant's machine, of the Kantian machine of Kant, is the moment when the machine comes to an infinite loop of comparison and calculation of magnitude. So the aesthetic infinite is when the moment when the imagination was in a constant looping, in the infinite looping, that it could not produce a concept. And it's the moment that reason has to impose a violence in imagination. So creating to stop the imagination from functioning in order to produce, to arrive at a status. And this status is the sublime. And this is also the moment where the horror comes. So what I'm trying to say, to simply put it, is that in the mathematics, if in algorithms, what we find the infinite, the inscription of the infinite in the finite is always aiming for completeness, for kind of for completion or complete representation, expression. But while in the aesthetic sublime, aesthetic infinite, for example, what we find here is always a kind of we find an additional act in where reason has to impose a violence to imagination to stop this process from functioning. And this violence is also produce a quantic leap, produce a kind of speaking related to the conference, a quantic leap that is the source of horror, but also the source of respect in the moral sense. So someone may raise the question: are we not, comparing the artificial imagination, a machine, and the imagination that where we discuss in related to Kant's, not a kind of human a defense of human faculties against artificial. This is not what I mean to say. What I try to show is that, in fact, today, if we think of the situation that we are living in related to the biopolitics and in calling to the surveillance society, actually we are confronting a conflict of faculties. Maybe we can refer to the other text of Immanuel Kant. And today, if we want to I want to raise the question of aesthetic education again, is that I would like to suggest that actually we need to think the question of artificial intelligence, artificial imagination, by placing it in a much broader context, which I called as following Schiller as aesthetic education. So to conclude, there are 2 points I would like to make. First of all, is the artificiality of imagination. The second is that in the machine imagination, which I don't know if we should really give it such a name, is that it always involves a kind of a containment of the infinite in the finite, while this mathematical infinite is always refers to is always a completion of while in the aesthetic infinite, what we found is a quantic leap that produces elevation of feeling and senses. So, but I think I'm running out of time now. But I would like to, because I don't have time, but I would simply wanted to show a slide that here, that's how Schiller was trying to resolve the problem by conceiving an aesthetic education in which is able to reconcile, on the one hand, the rationality, and on the other hand, feeling, and as well as the rationality of the state, but the individual freedom through art, through aesthetic education. So I think that we are actually confront a rather similar situation, and I would like to invite you to think artificial intelligence, artificial imagination, organologically, as I said at the very beginning. On the first of all, to recognize the artificiality of imagination, and secondly, to recognize to think the relation between the operation of machines, for example, artificial intelligence, in related to aesthetic, the aesthetic infinite that I was referring to Immanuel Kant, in order to perceive a program of aesthetic education that could, for me, is a possible response to the problems that we have been living with. And maybe from that perspective, we can have a different understanding of the agenda of artificial imagination. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuk Hui. This is very, very interesting. Don't you hear me? Can you put my microphone on?
Sorry?
Do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay, yeah. So no, I mean, I'm very interested in all this work that you've been doing. And again, there is a very strong component of linguistics involved in what you're saying. A lot of the things that you are describing have a strong essence of where they come from, what is the language that is being used, even describing the infinite. It's again based on the language, what we use. We use the word infinite, which is basically the lack of finite. So it's basically two words that we put together. We don't know what it means. It's just a connection between things. Like we know what end is, we know what the world is, but if we put them together, we get the end of the world. But we don't know what that is. It's the poetic, sort of like linguistic connection between things. And that's very interesting because, I'm Greek, and many of the words that you use, including imagination, which in Greek is fantasy. Fantasy is imagination. And in the morning, we had the word history, which was, again, another interesting word. All of them, strangely enough, are lending themselves to a root word, which is the word light. Light is a very protarchic, a very archetypal word that is being used along quite extensively in Greek philosophy. And what's interesting about light is that it has 2 points of view. The light can be something that it brings to you, which is knowledge, and it's to us as humans. What is light? Light is the thing that actually we see. It makes us see the world, and that kind of like metaphorically means that it's the thing that allow us to understand things, right? That's what light is, because we can see now. But at the same time, light has a mind of its own. It's a thing on itself. Regardless of our existence, light exists. And light does things, whatever it does, quantum phenomena, if you like, things that are beyond our apprehension. And that is, I think, the whole point of the argument that we're trying to put here, is to investigate whether or not the things, regardless of the human, the distance between the human and the thing, the observed and the observer, okay, that, I think, becomes the most interesting part when we flip on the other side and we get into the side of the things, the existence of things, regardless of us. And I think you actually made a very interesting argument with the word freedom. You use the word freedom, and together with the word intuition, coming from the Kantian kind of a tradition. And so my question, I mean, it's not really a question, it's more like a remark, is that how do you understand the concept of freedom? Is freedom something that is ours, or freedom is outside of us?
Right.
From your point of view, not Kant. I'm not interested in Kant. We know Kant. He's like a humanist. We know all that stuff. That's a long time ago. But from your point of view, how do you define freedom?
Well, I think this is a big question, and I think it is a question that deserves a book on its own. The concept of freedom, the concept of freedom. But what maybe we can say in this way is because for me, freedom is a necessity. Freedom is a necessity, and freedom is a reason itself. The reason is because first of all, we have to make a distinction between arbitrary arbitrariness. So, for example, I like this, I like that. I want to vote for Biden, I want to vote for Trump. This is arbitrary. But of course, today we call it freedom, but this is not freedom. This is only something arbitrary. It's like when you go to McDonald's, are you going to have which burger you would like to choose? Something arbitrary. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. Afterward, you will be, after you eat it, you will be full. You'll be stuffed with
that's
something.
Your Coke, yeah.
Without nutrients, the same consequence. But freedom is different. Freedom is not contingent, because you choose which burger is contingent. But freedom is not contingent. Freedom is necessary. It's a necessity, and the necessity of freedom, in this case, it can only be reason. It can be only be reason, and so that's what I would say. What is a freedom? It's not about what we can choose, but rather in the space which allows us to exercise our reason. We know this is similar to the resonance with what Kant might call the public use of reason, but it was not very. Kant didn't say in the way that I talk about it, but rather freedom is the space where we are able to exercise our reason and to pursue this possibility of the exercise of freedom.
So freedom is imagination.
Freedom is imagination rationalized.
Okay, which brings us to the original argument about its artificiality, right? Which is where it cannot be human; it has to be artificial.
Right. So the points what I'm trying to make, I'm trying to make 2 points, but because my article is a little bit too long, so I skipped almost half of it. But I was trying to say trying to communicate is, first of all, that imagination is always artificial. So if we want to talk about reason, we must also talk about the artificiality of reason. The artificiality of reason, and I think this is very much an ontological argument. The second point I wanted to communicate is that we, like what you said, I'm very much interested in speculation. I also want to speculate what is happening in the artificial imagination of a machine, and that is a very interesting question for me. Since I was a student of computer science, and that was also basically my PhD thesis. I want to understand what could only be understood by machines, but not by humans. But in this, in my talk, I try to communicate in that where it is a very important question. But at the same time, when you talk about art today, I would like to propose to talk about an aesthetic education, which for me has the form, has the meaning of an organological sense. That how could we think of this aesthetic education together with what you called artificial imagination? Instead of isolating artificial imagination and to try to understand what really is inside without the human observation.
Okay, because at the interest of time, we have to continue. The reason why I brought up the question is because Yuk has to leave, and we wanted to actually kind of strain his brain for a minute before he leaves. Okay, so with that being said, thank you very much for your lecture.